So in this episode, I'm speaking to Jonathan Wright again, the CEO of the Firearms Policy Campaign. And we are talking a little bit about the history of South Africa, the Colonial Times, the old Cape Province, Natal, the start of the Orange Free State Province, and the ZAR, what later became known as the Transvaal. And we're focusing specifically on legislation, and more specifically legislation regarding firearms and ammunition. All in all, a very interesting chat and very interesting history, and this is part one. There will be quite a few parts of this as we catch up with history up to where we find ourselves today. Enjoy. Good evening, Rian Kutsia, Fortis Proactive Defense Solutions. I'm back talking to Jonathan Wright, the CEO of the Firearms Policy Campaign. And tonight we're going to be discussing, history of firearms and ammunition laws in the old colonial era, the Cape, the Natal, the ZAR later, and then obviously the Free State much later than that. So, Jonathan, welcome back.
Thank you, Jan. Always good to be here.
Well, I'm looking forward to this. Look, I've always been interested in history. So I think getting some context on the history of everything is always nice to know these things, where it started. So, we just want to get this in for some social context. So, the colonial area, the 1700s, the VOC, take us back in time and talk to us about what they did back then, the lawmakers, that upset people hundreds of years ago already.
There's a lot that upset a lot of people 100 years ago. But yeah, it really does, as you say, it starts with the VOC, the Dutch. They got here. I'm not going to say they were here first. Someone's going to pillory me for the Khoi were here first or something like that. But they were the first Europeans here, the Dutch. And from the start, they realized that they weren't very comfortable with the locals acquiring firearms. Initially, they were actually quite terrified of them, the locals. That is, the local Khoi, the San, whoever it was. You would be too if you just saw some strange white people get off a boat and they have these boomsticks that flash and can kill animals in one shot. Whereas they would, as most people would know, they would often bows and arrows, and they would run their prey to exhaustion by chasing it. And so, the first law comes with the Dutch when they just said, these are rules. Don't give your guns to the locals. Keep it as far away from them as possible. And that kept on until, they said they got here 1652, whatever it was. And 1795, the Napoleonic Wars, I think Napoleon came later, but there were wars in Europe. There always are wars in Europe whenever Prussia, France, and the UK is involved in something. And so they took the Cape, and then they gave it back to the Dutch, and they took it again in 1806, and they kept it this time. And that was when they really started to make laws for the first time in South Africa. And they really just kept the Dutch laws until the 1830s. So it's quite a long time. And the Dutch laws, like as I said, they were just kind of basically some words scribbled on a paper somewhere that says, don't do this, do that, or whatever. And in 1831, I think it was 1831, Ordinance 81 of 1831, they actually made the first law that kind of came on this topic. And it wasn't about firearms specifically, it was about trading. Trading beyond the frontier. And for one of the very interesting things that I learned in this process with my doctorate is just how the Cape frontier, it just creeps more and more and more and more inland all the time. It was like a sliver along, it was just Cape Town at one point, and then suddenly it goes all the way up to the borders of the Cape province before they were divided into Eastern, Western, and Northern Cape. So back when these frontiers were still very limited, they made this frontier trading ordinance that said, look, if you're gonna go across the border, you're going to go the frontier, you're gonna go trade, you're gonna find people, you're gonna find other Europeans, explorers, hunters, and locals, or for lack of a better word, really, the black native peoples and tribes of the interior. And they said, you're allowed to trade with them, you can do whatever you want with them, but there are two things you cannot do. You cannot kidnap them and bring them back as slaves, and you cannot give them guns. Don't do. And when you left the province, when you crossed the frontier, you had to go to a magistrate or a civil commissioner, and you had to say, here's an inventory of all the servants I'm taking, here are the guns I'm taking, the ammunition. And when you came, and you'd get given a receipt, and when you came back in, you had to present it again. And if you had more servants or less, you had to say, okay, they died or they ran away or whatever. Or if you had more, where did they
Okay.
come from? Can't
Yes.
do that. And if they were against their will, then contract null and void, and they were free people immediately. But guns would get you in trouble if you had less than you left with. They really didn't like the idea of the black tribes getting hold of guns.
Mm.
And that again, they didn't really make any specific laws like Arms and Ammunition Act or things like that for quite a while. That wouldn't happen until, like the 1850s, really. There was a Cape monopoly, government monopoly on gunpowder, until 1834, when they said, nope, this is now a private thing, you can go do your thing. And they kept records. That was our first early stages of regulation on the commercial side of things. But then the control rationale started to set in a little bit. It gets a lot worse a lot later, but for now it's just a little bit there. For example, lead. That was the
Mm.
ammunition, as you know, you shot. It's not the centerfire cartridge doesn't come along until the 1870s.
Yeah.
And so ammunition consists of lead, and that means pipe, sheet metal, whatever. That's a controlled item. Like now imagine the government with CSP coming out with that. Like, okay, now because there's lead inside the bullets that you fire, we're going to like, no, that's not going to work. But maybe we shouldn't say that too loudly, because there's no shortage of bad ideas at the CSP, as we discussed the last week.
So
So
just as a matter of interest on that point, because we know they cast lead balls, which was the actual projectile. So the government of the time actually started prohibiting people from uh, making
possessing
making
lead, they kept controls on
lead,
the
or
lead.
that, yeah, from possessing lead, any sort of in any sort of
Any
format.
sort of lead pipe, ball, whatever. It was basically controlled.
That I could imagine, because I'm thinking now about today, with all these proposed amendments and stuff to the Firearms Control Act that we have been talking about quite extensively, and people are, they are upset, man. So I can just imagine how these guys, all these hundreds of years ago, suddenly they are faced with this piece of paper saying you may not possess any lead. In fact, anything you've got that contains lead, we're coming to confiscate. They must have been furious.
I don't know what their impressions were. All I know is that what the law said is that that was controlled. Probably wasn't that
Yeah,
much of an issue. Otherwise, I mean,
I
people were
I
very
don't
simple
know.
back then. They didn't need too much. But yeah, on the topic of getting people upset, we shouldn't. We're going to have to at some point, but for now, maybe we shouldn't tell the CSP about 3D printers and what they can do, because.
Yes.
Uh, and so this goes on until the 1850s, where they start to give it a bit more attention. And the important thing to really, the Cape lawmaking tradition can be broken in two. Pre-1870s, like 1874, that's like the cutoff, 1875. Up until then, you've got this liberal dispensation where we don't care. Like the general gist of it is we don't care and about who's got firearms and who doesn't. Like you go to the magistrate, you get a permit, done. Didn't matter if you were black, white, Hottentot, as they called them in those days. Didn't matter at all. Uh, it was, they didn't like the idea of controls because even though the government was perpetually fearful of a native uprising, especially on the eastern frontier with the Xhosa, who they were quite belligerent, and yes, the colonial government didn't make it easy for them. I'm not saying that it's a one-side thing. It's a very complex issue, and I don't really want to go too deep into that because it could be here forever. But suffice it to say, the British in the Cape applied pressure, the Xhosa responded. The British retaliated, the Xhosa responded, and it just goes on this ping-pong battle for, well, until 1875, where that's like the end of the Xhosa. And it really was quite remarkable to see just what the British attitude, the Cape attitude was. They didn't like controls. They thought Maltino, and John Merriman specifically, they thought it was a financial and administrative irritation and a burden. Their solution was like, look, if we were so worried about the Xhosa, let's just have an army that's big enough to crush them if they step out of line. That'll be cheaper.
Okay.
That'll be cheaper than regulating everything, like every single musket we can find. And then the economy can grow. Because they contrasted that with what was going on in Natal from 1847. From the get-go, Natal was just control, 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 control. In fact, that is what my LLD research showed to me. South Africa's control tradition starts in Natal. Nothing good comes out of
Okay.
Natal in this sense. Controller of Arms and Ammunition, 1876. Literally CFR, but for colonial South Africa. And they were really nervous about black people with firearms. They did not like it at all. And they got very nervous, and that is what resulted in the Langalibelele affair, which is a topic all by itself, and I'm sure we will talk about it in a separate video because you could make a Netflix miniseries out of that.
Yeah.
And yeah, but they were looking for rifles and muskets under every rock that could be turned over. They were paranoid. There was not much difference between when I read the Hansard and when I read the laws, I did not see a difference between Natal in 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, well, up until 1906, and South Africa today, the CSP.
In
Almost
terms
no
of that paranoia.
Yeah, that paranoia, and that is what it is. I think one of the words, well, one of the paraphrases used by one of the other historians, citing Maltino, was, yeah, they were just not concerned with firearms the same way Natal was, literally looking for a firearm under every rock that they could find and registering it and marking it. And so that's the Natal one in a nutshell. There really isn't much to say about it. The Cape has this dichotomy of liberal to the anti-liberals, which I haven't actually spoken about them yet because I'm trying to keep a broad timeline going here. But yeah, I'm not going to go to the anti-liberals yet. Orange Free State, Oranje Vrystaat, Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, the other two actors on the scene. Very interesting stories in their own right as well. Do you know from which state your ancestry comes from?
Yeah. You're
Are
talking
you
about
more
the Free State.
Transvaal or Orange Free State?
Free State.
Orange Free State, yeah. Okay. Half of me is from there as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, my ancestors would not be too proud of of my Afrikaans skills, but I do try. So they can be proud of me for that. But yeah, the Orange Free State, let's start with the ZAR actually, because they came first. The Sand River Convention, I think 1853. Yeah, a kaleidoscope of a comic opera, as one historian described them in 1906 or 1901. Not a serious state by any means. Their laws of all types were it was a real Wild West type country. No one, the government was a joke. No one ever listened to it. Couldn't bankrupt by the 1860s because they bought all the equipment for material to build a railroad, and they had no money left over to actually build it. So,
Oh,
yeah. But
nobody
their
plans for the
lawmaking
building phase.
sounds familiar, doesn't it? Yeah, the paradigms between colonial South Africa and modern South Africa were quite interesting in many ways. Cadre deployment, yeah, they were doing it there too as well. So they did it before the ANC did. Surprise, surprise. But as far as firearms are concerned, it was an absolute mess. They had so many different sources of law. They had Volksraad proclamations and resolutions. They had proclamations from the president. They had actual acts of the Volksraad. And however Paul Kruger felt when he woke up that morning, it's all over the place. It's very difficult. It was very difficult to actually figure out what was going on there, and uh, very, very racist. Like the Cape and Natal were like, yeah, we don't want the black people to have firearms, but in the ZAR, that was, yeah, they were quite visceral about it, and they tried to make a native policy. They didn't succeed very much in that. And that topic, the native policy, that's also a whole nother video on the Confederation of South Africa, which didn't succeed. But in terms of actual law, they made the first law that I could find on what the safe environment of using a firearm. They said you cannot shoot or discharge a rifle or any firearm within 1,000 steps of an urban area. So,
Oh, okay.
that was quite an interesting one. But generally, they didn't have much in the way of laws. They just said, don't let the black people have it. If they find one with it, well, huge fines, very nasty penalties, but generally all over the place. No real consistent lawmaking tradition. And in fact, for the most part, they let the black tribes within their territory govern themselves, and in a state of semi-detached autonomy. But when the government wanted land for white farmers or white Boers, they went and took it, and that caused friction. The Orange Free State is by far the most interesting one of the three when it comes to how they approach the topic. They almost wrote no laws whatsoever until the 1890s. And that was just for the whole militia model because they didn't have a standing army. The whole model for them was, why do we need an army? We can have a professional artillery corps, but we will just use the people, just give them rifles. They had state programs to subsidize rifles for poor burghers so that everybody had a rifle and at least 10 rounds of ammunition. And they had state-sponsored shooting competitions with prizes. And you could shoot them, but you weren't allowed to use a rest or shooting position like that. And you weren't allowed to use optics. They called it glass.
That's right.
Because that's all the red dot users out there reject modernity, embrace tradition. And so that was how the Free State approached it. And even in 1899, if you were black, you could actually get a firearm permit. You just needed a character reference to be of good repute.
In the Orange Free State.
In the Orange Free State, yeah.
That's interesting because I mean you mentioned that they were extremely racist, and I mean, Jonathan, that this is a part of our history. We don't have to be proud of it, but it's a part of our history. So it doesn't help to sort of pretend it didn't happen. But it's interesting to me now that in the Orange Free State, with that background, they allowed the black population to own firearms under these conditions, obviously, which you'll tell us more about just now, how a character reference works. Whilst in the Cape province, which was much more liberal when it comes to this, they were very adamant that only the European part of the population can have firearms. What brought that specific change about? Do you know?
Well, it wasn't that the Cape said that only the Europeans may have. Maybe I wasn't clear enough on that. They
Mhm.
didn't mind if black people had it within the frontiers of the colony. If you were black and outside the frontiers, that was a concern, especially
I
if you were a
see.
causer, because there was a lot of fighting over land in the Zeeveld, Grahamstown area, Queenstown, King Williamstown, that area, Etenaar sort of thing. And uh, so yeah, the Cape was very liberal in that way. They were the most liberal. They didn't
Mhm.
mind. They just didn't want you to cause trouble. Whereas
Okay.
for the rest of the country, it was very much a default of we don't trust you. Orange Free State didn't have a large black population until 1910, and that was very surprising for me as well because uh, obviously today the Free State has a very large black population. But to
Yes.
think that back then, like all the other territories, Natal, Cape, ZAR, they were writing native policy and trying to figure out what to do with them. The Orange Free State was just like, well, why should we bother? Like there's barely any of them here. That would change by 1910, as I mentioned. But you can see that they were already thinking of it by 1899 because black people did want to get firearms or permits, and they needed to make a way to make it possible. And they said, okay, fine. So yeah, you can do it. You just need to be of good repute within the community. So they needed a white person to vouch for them. Might be one,
Okay.
might be two. I forget the details. But I mean, as you expect for the colonial era, it's all very laissez-faire. It's not exactly era of extreme stringent record keeping. Again, nothing like
Mm.
what's going on in Natal. And yeah, then when that era came to an end with the Second Anglo-Boer War, the ZAO and the Orange Free State obviously stopped being independent countries. And then they got their turn to be the subject of strict controls. But I could see it was almost like the Natal lawmaking regime was imported straight onto their things. Because they've just been
Okay.
defeated in battle and war, and you don't want your defeated, as far as the British are concerned, well, we just defeated these very proud and independent people. It's probably not a good idea to let them have too many guns so soon after we just defeated them.
This is just after the Anglo-Boer
Yeah,
Wars.
just after the war.
Mm.
And it didn't last long though, and this is where one of the more interesting things came up for me in this whole question of citizenship and what firearms mean to people. Because throughout the colonial era, uh, there's this constant uh, tug of war, this tension of what do firearms mean to people, citizenship, modernity, independence and self-sufficiency and self-reliance and that sort of thing. So for a lot of the black people that, like in the Cape, they wanted, like, if I'm trying to remember some of the quotes I came across now, um, in the Hansard, they said, well, the first thought of a black man is I need to get a good gun because then with it I can contend with the white man. And obviously that was said in a very antagonistic situation. I mean, it's a Parliament Hansard, so it is a white colonist who said that, and it was one of the more racist ones, I can tell you that. But in another case, there was an Mfengu soldier who, this was around the 1870s in the Cape, when they wanted to take away all the guns from the black people and this anti-liberal era, which I still haven't touched on yet. And they, at that time, they couldn't understand why the colonial government suddenly wanted to take away their guns because in their minds, like, look, if the white man has a gun, well, then I must have one too. Like, I don't mean him
Well, I
any harm.
mean, it makes sense. It
Yeah.
makes hunting that much easier for starters. So
Well,
it's a
that was one of the
sensible
interesting
thought.
things because Christian missionaries were one of the big supporters of black firearm ownership. Like they
Mm.
encouraged it. Like it was, uh, we need to bring three things to the unwashed heathens of the interior: God, Bibles, and guns. And that's what they would do. Because in line with Christian theology of the time, it's like, look, these people, we're going to go and spread the gospel. But with that also comes a sense the missionaries weren't racists. They weren't controlling. And like, there's a lot of post-colonial theorists that have their theories. I don't think they hold much water. But for the missionaries, they're like, look, these people, they need to be able to protect themselves because we know for a fact that there are a lot of other Europeans that do not feel the same way we do about black people. And the best way to keep them safe is to give them guns so that they can keep themselves safe. This is like, isn't this exactly what most firearm owners and Fortis Pro preaches? Look after
Yes,
yourself.
look after yourself.
And so that's what they did. And the result was that it did make uh, the native tribes much more efficient hunters. And obviously the Europeans are also being very efficient hunters now. The result was that it just decimated the game population, which brings in another social angle to this because it forced greater integration of the traditional tribal lifestyle with the modern colonial economy. And this would become quite a big source of tension for conflict on the eastern frontier, in the Eastern Cape with the Causa, because the chiefs, they could, at the best of times, they could be okay, I guess, but it's not controversial to say that they could sometimes be downright despotic towards their own people and anyone else. And when they saw more and more of their people, their followers, leaving the tribe to go and work in the colonial economy and live there and adopt Western colonial ways and traditions, it was that they felt threatened, and understandably. I think it's a very entitled obsession. But I understand that for some of those tribal individuals, they voluntarily went and like, yes, the colonial economy is great. We're going to be here. That was the case with the Mfengu, who hated living near and around the Causa. But there were also a lot of Causa who were very proud of their traditional ways, and they wanted to stay out with their their nomadic lifestyle, which obviously they couldn't do because the colonial boundaries keep moving forwards, and they need more resources, and they're not agricultural experts by any means. They would move to a place, graze it till it's nothing left, and then move on. And they'd come back in a year or two, and then everything is recovered. They didn't know modern agriculture. So that caused a lot of friction. And this is where they started to rebel. They wanted their land, and the closest they ever came was 1820, the siege of Grahamstown. But after that, it was just they would wait to regain their strength, and then they'd go again. But they didn't have a great strategy. The strategy was, as soon as we're able to, we attack again, which never went well because the British kind of cottoned onto, okay, we can see what they're doing, we know what they want. And so
Yes.
even when they weren't really all that prepared, they still were able, like they ran out of momentum really quickly. It's like typical guerrilla warfare, I think, that if you're going to spring out of the bush and then suddenly make a concerted push, you'll get good surprise. You've got the element of surprise. You'll make good progress even in the initial stages. But then it runs out of momentum, discipline breaks down, people get the soldiers on the ground, they get distracted, if they go, or they just got tired. They're like, okay, we're done, we're going home now. It wasn't a
True.
modern military by any means, and they were quite disciplined. So they did, for the most part, especially in some of the worst wars, they did only kill the male colonists. They let the women and children go, which was quite interesting.
Okay.
Uh, Obviously, there was a bit of a misunderstanding when the colonists found their soldiers and other colonists that had been disemboweled. They thought it was just an act of barbarity and desecration. From the Causa perspective, it was like, no, we have to cut them open so their spirits can escape.
Yes. Yes.
Another interesting little thing of clashing cultures, I think. I'm not an expert on Causa culture by any means. This is just what I've read from the sources. So please, if you are Causa and you're watching this, uh, please leave a comment correcting me.
Yeah. Please do. That'll actually be very interesting.
Yeah. And yeah, so this constant conflict is what causes a lot of tension within the Cape Colony as well. You've got the liberals and you've got the anti-liberals. And the anti-liberals are mostly from the eastern frontier where all these wars are happening. And they are the ones that feel the brunt of it. The Western colonists, they don't deal with this. And that causes divisions because the Western colonists are like, no, we leave the black people alone. The Eastern ones are like, no, take away their guns, kick them off the land, whatever. And by the mid 1870s, the tides, the balance of power shifts, and the Western colonists lose that control. And then we get the Gunpowder Amendment of 1876, which radically restricts the issuing of gunpowder. It's prohibited beyond the frontier completely. The really strict record keeping. You can see we're starting to move towards Natal now, even modern
Yes.
South Africa in a sense, and how we perceive firearms and possession, but only by certain people. But there was a lot of certain colored people, put it that way. But there was a lot of
Mhm.
discontent because for the white colonists, they're like, look, this is making my life a lot very difficult. I used
Of
to just
course.
go and buy gunpowder, and now I have to pay stamps, fees, and duties and fill out forms. But it's all in the name of public safety. And then they got the Peace Preservation Act, which was just out and out. Yeah, now we're going to take guns away from all the black people. Like, it's not just the gunpowder we're throttling. Like, no, go find the guns, take them away. And that resulted in the Basotho War of the Gun, which is another topic
Okay.
that could probably be another mini series for Netflix. We should keep notes when we discuss those, and we can send it
I
off to
am actually.
Netflix. And so the 1870s as Confederation project all happens. The uniform native policy, a uniform firearm policy. Uh, these are two things that are seen. Like, it's interesting that it's not just a uniform native policy because every state, each country had a different way of doing things. Cape was liberal, Natal was something weird, the despotism on the side. The Orange Free State didn't have one, and the ZAR was just out and out racist. And so that confederation for all four territories would only make sense if they could bring them all together, if they could all agree on common theme. And
Mhm.
so one is obviously how do we treat the local black people? And unfortunately, that's almost always going to go the way of the lowest common denominator, which was the ZAR.
Okay.
Don't trust them at all, sort of thing. Don't give them any rights. I mean, in the Cape, they could vote if they had fixed property, for example.
Okay.
Obviously, not many of them had that, but there was an avenue to citizenship in that way. Um, the only other form of citizenship for them was a gun because it meant modernity. They were now part of the modern era, and the gun was a very tangible way of doing that. And it
Yes.
was very masculine. And as I said, it's self-reliance and like I can look after myself now. I can defend myself. I can defend my friend, and he can defend me, sort of thing. And so when the government started taking away these things, this caused a lot of problems. Obviously, almost causes a bit of an identity crisis, all on the pretext of the government will keep you safe, and that was one of the big paternalist driving factors behind it. And so they created this uniform native policy, but they also created a uniform firearm policy because it's no good that we treat black people the same throughout this entire confederation if we're going to allow them to have guns in this part but not this part. Ultimately, spoiler alert, Confederation fails spectacularly, but these two things do come into alignment organically at the time. And by
Mhm.
1910, no, there are no black people with guns, and if they do have any, it's like a really old technology. They don't have modern
Okay.
breech loaders and things like that. They're definitely not citizens in any sense of the word. And yeah, 3 years later, you get the 1913 Land Act. And then this kind of starts off the rest of South African history, where a lot of your audience is probably a lot more familiar with, even if it's just in terms of
Mhm.
the apartheid stuff that brings us to where we are today. And we will get there eventually in the course of these video series. One of the interesting things in around 1907, they were writing some new laws for the Transvaal and the Hansard, where they debate and argue these things. One of the things said by, I think it was the Colonial Secretary for the Transvaal, who says that something along the lines of every free person should be able to own a gun. Every citizen should be able to own a gun. And this tied a rifle specifically, and this tied in with the obviously English are now trying to create the Union of South Africa. But you can only create a Union of South Africa if there's if you can somehow unite the English and the Boer.
Yes.
And at this point, only the English are allowed to have rifles. Boers are not. They can have pistols, but they can't have rifles because rifles were a very powerful political symbol. And not surprising from the colonial era, it was a very strong political symbol for the black tribes as well, which is why it had to be taken away
Yes.
from them. But here they explicitly recognized it, and the colonial secretary says, if you're going to be a citizen of this country, you should have a rifle. And isn't this true for today as well? You should have the freedom of the choice to do something like that, to make a decision that you can look after yourself, your family, or just because you want to. You should not need a reason to own a gun.
Exactly.
So, yeah, those are the very broad strokes of the colonial era lawmaking and the political attitudes and sentiments. And I know I've done most of the talking in this time, but it is a
What
very unknown part of South African history, and it can be quite difficult to prepare for this sort of topic without any kind
Yeah,
of.
and yet very important because it is part of our history, and it preset certain mindsets that got carried over, and eventually we ended up in 2025.
Mhm.
The ZAR, the Zuid-Afrikaanse
Yeah,
Republiek, which was basically the old Transvaal, well, the
yeah,
Transvaal, yes.
yeah. It became the
Um,
Transvaal after 1900 or 1902,
after
basically.
9, yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So you mentioned that with the OFS, the Orange Free State, it seemed as if they basically just adopted the way that they were doing things in Natal. It was that still wasn't KwaZulu Natal, just Natal. So the way they did things when it comes to firearms and ammunition and stuff. What did the ZAR do a similar thing? That much more strict approach to the topic, or did they sort of look more towards the liberal side of the Cape?
The impression, it's easy to get the impression that they had no laws. Like they had some laws on international trading and transiting firearms and ammunition and other munitions of war through the territory by train and things like that. But I wasn't really able to find any kind of local law. Like there were suggestions that you needed to get a permit from the local Lantros, the magistrate,
Mhm.
but I didn't really find any actual law to that effect. So I'm sure there is something somewhere. And even in my doctorate, I say, look, this is just the most comprehensive effort done to date on this topic. It's very possible that I've missed laws. So
Mm.
if you do find them, I do not know about them. And I do know that they might exist. I just don't know about them now. Uh, the two Boer republics were by far the most difficult to actually find any information on. Whereas the Cape
That's
and
interesting.
Natal, there was just a huge amount. I almost would have preferred it just be for them to be like the Boer republics, but unfortunately not, because I had to go and read all the stuff.
Is that just because they were better administrators?
Yes, I think so. The British had brought with them a very strong legal tradition dating back hundreds of years by that point. The Boers all started
Yeah.
from scratch. the Orange Free State even started with a law book, like a civil code, much like most of continental Europe has today. Didn't survive the Boer War, and I think, thank goodness, I don't like the law book all that much. I think common law is much better. But yeah, there wasn't really much for either of those countries, and I had to really just go and look through 100-year-old books and go through the index, and maybe I found something related to arms and ammunition using my mediocre Dutch at best as well to try and get through this book. So there was no Afrikaans back then, it was Dutch.
Yes, indeed, it was all in Dutch. Yes, for the old the Orange Free State and the ZAR.
Yeah, it was for both of them.
And to boot, it wasn't modern Dutch either. It was the Dutch that they spoke back then,
Yeah.
which was a
It's fairly
very
close to modern Dutch,
heavy.
I found. So it's understandable.
Well,
Like, I didn't have much
it's
trouble with
yeah,
it.
but you have to really read with attention if you don't speak it fluently.
Yes. But yeah, I had to try and read
That's
these
right.
Dutch
Yes.
documents, and fortunately, some of them were quite well preserved. Stellenbosch University has a very good collection. The National Library of South Africa, and they're falling apart, and they're not well looked after, unfortunately. But there are a lot of sources out there, and it took a lot of work to go through this. Literally 16 principal laws just for Natal, and all the amendments, and putting it together, it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle. And then you got to understand the social situation of South Africa in the colonial era. Like, I've given at best, not even just a high level, I'm like a satellite in orbit overview of what's going on in this era. It's very complex. It's very difficult to find out, okay, these are the bad guys, these are the good guys. It's just a lot of gray, and some areas are grayer than others.
I suppose all one can do is just stick to the facts as you could pick it up, and let people figure the good and the bad guys out for themselves.
It becomes easier to find a bad guy going forward. Spoiler alert,
Yes.
it's the government. But
Isn't it always?
we'll get to them.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. When we'll get to them more and more. But for now, like, yeah, this is the colonial era in very high level overview. And we touched on these big landmark events, the Basotho War of the Gun, the Langalibelele affair. I mean, I don't discuss the Battle of Majuba Hill and the First Anglo-Boer War in any detail. I don't discuss it at all. I just mentioned it happened. Bunch of Boer farmers with muskets on a hill beat back the British Empire. And that's another example, like, without having to go into Langalibelele or the Basotho War of the Gun, just off there we see, okay, even the Boers have something to be proud about. Yes, it was the ZAR, and there was not a lot to be proud of about that country. But for these, however many Boers on the hill it was with their muskets and rifles, that's something to be proud of. And it shows that's the power of a determined defender. Again,
Exactly.
is this what we try to be or prepare for in the worst case scenario, which we hope never happens, but sometimes it does. And
yeah, I mean, that was the old British Empire. They were sort of rulers of half the known world at that stage. So to beat them and their professional armies back with a bunch of guys who are not professional soldiers in any way, they just happen to be extremely good shots. Certainly something.
And when we get to the Basotho of the Gun, I mean, it's easy to make a stereotypical caricature of these Sotho with blankets in the mountain with guns beating back the British Empire.
Because I think what we should do is do a video later in the series about that, because again, that's a very it's an important part of the whole story, and it's got a little bit of a kick to it, so well worth
It's a
discussion.
feel-good story. And whereas the Basotho War of the Gun is a feel-good story of like that real David versus Goliath, much like the First Anglo-Boer War, I think. although again, there's a lot of complexity there that kind of qualifies things a little bit, but it's still a victory nonetheless. It's that
Yes.
feel good David versus Goliath thing, especially when the the Goliath doesn't have any legitimate interest of being there, and they are overtly the bad guy in the scenario. Like, I do have my sympathies with the British in that for the purposes of the Anglo-Boer War. I mean, they did annex the ZAR for quite a while, under consensually, if I can put it that way. The ZAR was quite happy that they did it at the time, but after a while, the British alienated them and kind of gave them a reason to get upset and want their independence back, such as things go. And the
But
Langalibelele affair is just a soap opera.
isn't that just how the British went about it in those years? They were not necessarily out to make best friends as far as they went. I mean, their whole
Um,
history is.
I mean, they had reasons. They had reasons to annex the ZAR, and I'm not saying that they were necessarily good reasons. I think they were quite opportunistic. The gist was this country is so horrendously unstable that it could plunge the entire Southern Africa into chaos. If we don't annex it and restore order, then yeah, we're gonna have problems. I don't think it was that bad, and that they kind of just engineered the situation to suit them. But when they did it, there was no upsetness. Nobody was upset when they did it. The ZAR Boers were quite, oh, thank goodness somebody's here. Like now there's some normality going on, because you had cities and towns declaring independence left, right, and center, and it was a total circus. But like, we had this
Yes.
David versus Goliath, the Basotho, and the Langalibelele. It's tragic, really, what happens there. It's not a happy story at all. Uh, but there's a video to be made on those two topics alone,
I
each
think
one
so.
by themselves. But yeah, we'll get there. Got to
There's a
start somewhere.
story to be, yeah, there's a story to be told, and I think it's good to do that.
Yeah,
So,
we want people to
Jonathan,
be excited about the past, be inspired. I think that's the word that we really want people. Like, there's
yes,
something here for everybody. Even if it's not necessarily your people, there
yes,
is underlying emotions and a sentiment and relatable factors, if I can put it that way,
mm.
variables and situations that do that inspire. I can't overcomplicate it too much.
Now, the way I've always looked at it is history. You know, you can't sweep it under the rug. It is what it is. Um, and it is interesting, and in a lot of ways, it led to where we find ourselves today. It changed things, it changed the world, it changed scenarios, it changed mindsets. So it needs to be told as is. It doesn't help to pretend these things didn't happen. They did.
Yeah.
Jonathan, I think that was a rather entertaining conversation. For me, in any case, I trust for the viewers it will do so. You know, for the viewers, as always, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, smash that bell icon so that you can get notifications of future videos. There will be a bunch of more videos in this specific series as we just started with the Colonial Times now, so we'll work right up to the more modern times and address a few things in between. Jonathan is an absolute hive of information, and the reason for this is because he is busy finalizing his doctorate, and this is basically firearm ownership in South African history is what his doctorate is based on. So he's done so much research on the subject that he's become very knowledgeable about this. And very thank you for that, willing to share with us.
Yeah, and I'll say it's going to get a lot spicier. Like, this video is definitely one of the more boring themes, if I can put it that way. No one really cares about
Yes.
what the black letter law is, but it lays the groundwork for what's coming. And yeah, as I said, Netflix series. If we can turn it into that, I could make myself very rich.
Well, there we go. That's an idea. So, Jonathan, that's it. Thank you so much. We will talk again soon. You must enjoy the rest of your and enjoy training this weekend.
Yes, that's happening. I am looking forward to it.
Jonathan, enjoy your evening.
Yeah, thank you, Rian. I appreciate it, and we'll talk again soon.